Wyoming Territory, June 1882, the sun beat down on the dirt road outside the town of Glenrock, where horses kicked up dust and men leaned on porch rails, watching the world go by. That was the day they all laughed when Willa Keaton ran barefoot down Main Street, her apron torn, her face streaked with tears and soot. She run off from the Barclays place, someone called from the saloon steps. Just a no-good maid thinkin' she's too good to scrub floors. Another man chuckled, shaking his head. Willa kept running. She did not look back. She had not looked back when Mrs. Barclay slapped her for dropping a plate or when Mr. Barclay had started creeping too close by the wash-house. And she did not look back now, not even as her lungs burned and her feet bled from the gravel. She just needed to get to the edge of town, somewhere quiet, somewhere no one would know her name. She made it to the edge of the prairie, just past the last fence post, and collapsed by a cottonwood tree that leaned sideways like it had been tired for years. She curled up in the dry grass, hands over her ears to block out the faint sound of laughter still drifting on the wind. She did not notice the slow clop of hooves until the shadow fell over her. "Miss," a man's voice, low and steady. "You all right?" She sat up fast, pushing her tangled hair from her face. The man on the horse was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a worn trail coat, and his eyes the color of creek stones. His horse was dusty but strong, and tied to the saddle was a lasso, a bedroll, and a rifle. A cowboy. One who had seen 100 miles and did not blink at trouble. "I am fine," she said too fast. "I just need to rest, that's all." He swung down from the saddle, slow and careful, like he did not want to startle her. "Name's Silas Avery," he said, removing his hat. He knelt beside her, his voice quiet. "You are bleeding." She looked down. Her ankle was scraped raw. She winced. He reached for his saddlebag. "Let me help." Willa hesitated. She had run from every hand that had ever reached for her, including the ones that had looked kind at first, but something in Silas's eyes made her pause. There was no hunger in them. No judgment either, just watchfulness. Like a man who had seen plenty of storms and knew not to push against one, he poured canteen water onto a cloth and handed it to her. "You can clean it yourself, just do not let it fester." She took it. "Thank you." He sat in the grass beside her, not too close. He looked out over the prairie like it was the only place he had ever trusted. After a few minutes, she said, "I ran away from the Barclays." Her voice was quiet. "They said I was property, that I owed them for taking me in. But I was 14 when they pulled me off a wagon and put a broom in my hand. I have scrubbed their floors for 5 years. I have not seen my own face in a mirror that was not cracked in 3. Silas did not speak for a long moment. Then, "You did the right thing." She let out a shaky breath. "They said no one would want a runaway maid. They were wrong." She turned toward him, his face open under the wide sky. He looked like a man who had lost things too, a man who knew how to sit with silence without trying to fill it. "What will they do to me if I stay in town?" she asked. "They will talk, maybe worse." He looked at her steady. "But they will not touch you, not if I am standing beside you." Her throat tightened. "Why would you help me? You do not even know me." He took off his bandana and tied it over her ankle. His hands were rough but gentle. "Because someone should have helped you a long time ago." She stared at him. The wind blew her hair into her face and he reached out, brushed it back without asking. Then he did something she never expected. Silas got to one knee in the dirt, looked her square in the eye and said, "You do not have to be who they said you were. You can be someone new. If you want a name they cannot touch, I will give you one. And if you want a place that is yours, I will ride until I find it." Willa blinked. "Are you asking me to marry you?" He smiled just a little. "Not unless you want it, but I am offering you a name, my name, if you want a way out." Tears burned behind her eyes. "Willa Avery," she whispered. He nodded. "Willa Avery, then." She reached for his hand. He took it, warm and solid against hers. They rode out that afternoon, her behind him on the horse, arms wrapped around his waist as the wind picked up and Glenrock faded behind them. The sunset spread gold over the plains, and she rested her cheek against his back. She did not know where they would go yet. But she knew what she had now: a man who had not mocked her, not touched her without kindness, not asked anything of her she did not choose to give. And for the first time in years, her heart felt quiet. Safe, wanted, Willa Keaton was gone. Willa Avery had just begun. They rode until the sky drained of color and the stars came out sharp and cold. Silas led them west, along a wagon-rutted trail that veered off from the main road. By the time they made camp near a shallow bend in the North Platte River, Willa's arms ached from holding on, and her legs trembled when she slid off the horse. Silas tethered the gelding to a mesquite bush and handed Willa a wool blanket from his pack. "It gets colder than you'd expect out here, even in June." She didn't argue. The air had already dropped, and her dress clung damp to her back. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and sat near the fire as he struck flint to kindling. Sparks caught, and soon the flames cast a soft glow across his face as he worked. "You always travel alone?" she asked, folding her hands around her knees. He didn't look up. "I've tried it other ways." She waited, but he didn't explain further. The fire popped, and the smell of burning juniper mixed with the damp scent of riverbank reeds. He finally glanced at her, his voice quieter than before. "My brother used to ride with me. Nate. He was better at talking to folks. He could trade a mule for a rifle and still get supper thrown in." "What happened?" "Colorado winter. Snow came in fast. He didn't make it down from the ridge." Willa didn't speak. She didn't need to. The way he stared into the flames told her he'd already said more than he usually did. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a square scrap of linen, the only thing she'd kept from her mother, a hand-stitched corner of a pillowcase. The edges yellowed, the threadwork faded. She turned it between her fingers. "You ever think about stopping somewhere? Settling?" He nodded once. "I've thought on it more lately. Because of me," he didn't answer right away. "Then, because I'm tired of riding past things I want." She looked up, caught the way he watched her, not with expectation, but with a kind of quiet certainty. Like he'd already decided what mattered and was just waiting to see if she'd meet him there. "What would it look like?" she asked. "That kind of life." He added another log to the fire. "Small house, nothing fancy, maybe a few goats, chickens if we can keep the hawks off them. You'd have a porch with a view of the hills, and I'd be close enough to reach you before supper burned." She smiled before she meant to. "And what would I do?" "Whatever you wanted. Bake, read, sit, yell at me when I forget to bring in the wash." Willa leaned against her knees, watching him. He'd stopped pretending to be anything he wasn't. There was a steadiness in him, something that didn't waver even in the dark. It made her feel like the ground wouldn't give way beneath her feet anymore. "You'd really want that with me?" A girl who's never had more than one dress to her name, he met her eyes. "I want someone who knows how to keep going when it's hardest. That narrows things down to about 3 people west of the Mississippi. And only one of them is sitting across this fire." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of river mud and wild mint. She pulled the blanket tighter. He reached into his saddlebag and passed her a tin of cold beans and a hunk of hardtack. "Ain't much, but it's better warm." He handed her the pan to set near the flame. As the beans simmered, she asked, "Where are we headed?" "There's land near Laramie. A widow passed last fall, no kin to claim her parcel. I know the man who's sorting the deeds. He owes me." Willa tilted her head. "For what?" "I pulled his boy out of a snowdrift last winter, carried him 5 miles to town. His lungs held." She looked back at the fire. "Seems like you've already saved more people than most men try to." "I don't keep score," he said simply. They ate without speaking after that, passing the tin back and forth, the silence not heavy but settled, like a quilt laid over old bones. Later, when the fire was low and the stars had shifted, Willa lay wrapped in the blanket on one side of the flames while Silas took the other. Neither of them said good night. It didn't feel necessary. She watched his silhouette, the rise and fall of his chest, the faint curve of his jaw where moonlight caught it. For the first time in years, she didn't feel hunted, didn't feel like her breath would be stolen in the night. She closed her eyes, and somewhere, just before sleep took her, She thought not of the Barclay house or of broken plates, or of scornful laughter, but of a porch that looked toward hills and a man who didn't flinch when she said her real name. By late morning, the ground had warmed and the dew had burned off the prairie grass. Silas let Willa ride up front for the first stretch, reins loose in her hands. He rode beside her, one hand resting easy on his saddle horn, the other adjusting the brim of his hat against the glare. They didn't speak much as the miles passed. Willa's gaze stayed forward, scanning the land like it might suddenly vanish if she looked away. There was a quiet steadiness to her posture now, no longer hunched or wary, but upright, shoulders square. She didn't cling to the saddle horn like she had the day before. By mid-afternoon, they reached a cluster of cottonwoods near a shallow creek. Silas drew the horses to a stop and nodded toward the water. "They'll need rest, and you ought to eat." Willa dismounted without help, her balance sure. She crouched by the stream, cupping water in her hands, watching the way it flowed between her fingers. Silas unsaddled the horses and let them graze. He pulled bread from his pack and broke it, offering her half. "Your hands ever get tired?" she asked, accepting the crust. He looked down at them, broad-palmed, knuckles darkened by old scars. "They don't notice anymore. I guess that kind of ache just becomes part of you." She chewed slowly, then said, "I used to think if I worked hard enough, they'd stop looking at me like I was something to be owned." He didn't interrupt. "But it was never about how clean the floor was," she said. "It was about reminding me where I stood." Silas leaned back onto his elbows, looking up through the branches. "I was 6 when my father told me a man's worth came from what he protected. That was the only thing he said that stuck." Willa turned her face toward him. "What else did he teach you?" Silas tugged a dry blade of grass and twisted it between his fingers. "How to drink too much, how to leave before the sun rose." She nodded once and didn't press further. A breeze moved through the leaves and the horses shifted their weight, tails flicking at flies. The silence between them stretched, but it didn't feel empty. "What made you stop?" she asked. Silas glanced at her. "Stop what? Riding without anywhere to land." He didn't answer right away. "Then you," Willa's breath caught. She set her crust aside and wiped her hands on her skirt. "I haven't known kindness that didn't come with a price," she said. "You still don't," Silas told her. "Only now the price is letting someone stay." She looked down at the grass, then back at him. "You're not waiting for me to be somebody else." "No. Just waiting for you to believe you don't have to run anymore." They sat like that for a long while, until the shadows shifted and the sun bent lower in the sky when they rode again. Willa didn't ask where they were headed. She didn't need to. The land spread wide and open before them, and for once, that didn't scare her. As they crested a low ridge, Silas pointed ahead. "See that line of dark? That's timber. Just beyond it is the land I told you about." Willa shaded her eyes. "You think it's still empty? Even if it's not, we'll find another. There's no shortage of places to begin again." She smiled, not wide but real. "I never thought I'd be part of a beginning." He reached across the saddle space between them, his hand closing gently around hers. "You are now," he said. They rode on, the hills ahead dappled in gold, the sky stretching wider with every step. By the third morning, the land softened. The ridges eased into low hills, and the wind carried the scent of pine resin. Silas guided them toward a blackened fence line, half fallen, its rails warped from years of weather. Beyond it, the remains of a cabin stood, roof sagged, door hanging by one hinge, but the stones of the chimney held firm. "This was hers?" Willa asked, her voice quiet as they dismounted. Silas nodded. "Emma Langley, widow of a trapper, lived alone near 8 years. Folks said she never locked her door." Willa stepped through the weeds, her skirt brushing against dry stems. Inside, the air was cool and still. Dust coated the floor, but there was a hearth and a narrow loft above where a rope ladder still hung. She touched one of the rafters, the wood warm beneath her palm. "It feels like it's waiting," she said. Silas leaned against the doorframe. "If the claim's still good, it's yours." She turned to him. "Ours." He didn't answer with words, just nodded once, low and sure. They spent the day clearing brush from the porch and dragging fallen limbs away from the walls. Willa found a rusted kettle buried beneath a pile of ash in the hearth. She set it gently on the windowsill, as if placing it there marked the beginning of something. As the sun slid lower, Silas unrolled his tools and began to brace the broken door with pine planks he'd carried in from the timberline. Willa watched him work, then asked, "What did you used to want before all this?" He didn't look up. "Used to want to outrun my name, thought if I kept moving, no one could pin it to me. And now," he set another nail, then finally met her eyes. "Now I want a place where I can say it out loud and have someone say it back." She crossed the room slowly, the floor creaking under her bare steps. "Silas Avery," she said. He didn't speak, just stood still as her fingers found his. "I've never had a voice that mattered," she said. "Not till I used it to call you." His hand closed around hers. "You matter now." They stood in the dimming light, no longer strangers beside a fire, but two people with their hands on the same future. Later, they made camp just outside the cabin, under a sky already silvered with stars. Willa sat beside the low fire, sewing a torn hem with thread from Silas's pack. He was oiling his saddle straps, his movements quiet and familiar. "I think I'd like hens," she said. He looked up. "We can ride to Fort Laramie next week. There's a trader there. Has a mean rooster and a sister who sells eggs." Willa smiled, her needle pausing. "And maybe a dog, one that doesn't bark too much, as long as it doesn't chase the goats." She tilted her head. "I never said anything about goats." He grinned but said nothing. The fire crackled between them. She finished her stitch and tied it off, setting the fabric aside. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said after a long pause. "I've never tended land, never planted a seed." "You'll learn," Silas said. "Same way I did. One mistake at a time." She leaned back on her elbows, the stars spinning slowly above them. "Do you think it's foolish?" "No," he said. "I think it's brave." The wind shifted and the scent of pine and earth settled around them, deep and grounding. Willa watched the sparks lift into the dark. "I want to wake up here," she said. "Not just sleep, I want to be here when the snow comes." Silas nodded, his voice low. "Then we'll build thicker walls, we'll seal the roof and fill the stores, you won't be cold." She looked at him, and this time there was no question in her eyes. Just certainty, quiet as the fire dying beside them. He reached out, not for her hand but for her cheek, his thumb brushing the soft edge of her jaw. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She leaned into his touch, not hesitating, not afraid. And when he bent to kiss her, it was not rushed or uncertain. It was the kind of kiss that came after everything else had been stripped away, after the names they'd been called and the things they'd lost had been left behind. It was a beginning not sparked from desperation, but built from the slow, steady work of choosing one another. When they lay down side by side, it was not with urgency but with belonging. Willa closed her eyes, the sound of night insects rising around them, the scent of smoke in her hair. She had run barefoot down a street where no one called her by name. Now she rested beside a man who had spoken it with his whole heart. The first real rain came 2 weeks later, slow and steady, soaking the earth instead of tearing through it. Willa stood barefoot on the cabin's porch, watching the drops ripple through the water trough. The ground smelled different afterward, richer, like something waking up. Inside, Silas was bent over the table he'd built from 2 salvaged barn doors, oiling the hinges of a small iron stove a ranch widow had traded for fence work. He glanced up as she came in, her hem damp, her cheeks flushed. "You think the creek'll rise?" she asked, toweling her arms. "No more than a hand's length. Soil's been thirsty." She nodded, then crouched to tuck kindling into the stove's belly. "I want to try bread tomorrow, not the flat kind, one that rises." "You'll need sour," he said. "I've seen it made with flour and creek water. Takes patience." "I've got that now," she said, meeting his eyes. That night he carved a shelf for her needlework and watched as she folded her linens into a cedar box she'd lined with dried sage. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate. She didn't ask where she belonged anymore, she just took up space like it was hers. Later, As he sharpened the edge of his hatchet by the fire, she sat near his knee and ran her hand along his boot. "You ever think about what you teach a child?" she asked. He looked down at her, the firelight drawing soft hollows beneath her collarbone. How to tie a knot, how to listen before speaking, and how to recognize when someone's worth holding on to. She pressed her cheek to his leg. "Then I hope we have a quiet one." "I was never good at shouting." He leaned forward, brushing his fingers through her hair. "Doesn't matter if they cry like a windstorm or not at all. They'll be ours." She smiled against him, and he felt something settle in his chest like a fence post driven deep into good earth. By midsummer, the cabin stood solid. They'd patched the roof with bark and tar, built shutters from scrap wood, planted carrots and beans in neat rows behind the house. Willa stitched curtains from flour sacks and lined the pantry with jars of pickled turnip and wild plum. They rode to Laramie once, trading tanned hides for seed potatoes and a copper kettle. On the way back, they stopped at a ridge where the wind came clean off the plains. Willa stood beside him, hair pinned up beneath her straw bonnet, and pointed to a place where the grass bent in waves. "There," she said. "That's where we'll put a swing, just rope and a board, nothing else." He kissed the top of her head. "And a bench so I can sit and watch you swing." They didn't speak of the Barclays or the streets of Glenrock again. Those things lost their shape in the face of the life they were building, one fence post, one loaf of bread, one sunrise at a time. In autumn, they built a chicken coop from river stones and driftwood. Willa named the hens after herbs: thyme, clover, rue. Silas laughed when she taught them to come to the sound of a tin spoon tapping the feed pail. They made cider from wild apples and pressed it together, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, his hands stained from pulp. That night they drank it warmed by the fire, her feet tucked beneath his coat. "You ever afraid it's too good?" she whispered. He turned to her. "No, because it's not luck. We made all of this." Winter came early, but they were ready. The stove held heat through the night and the root cellar stayed dry. They read by lamplight, passing pages back and forth, her voice low and steady as she read aloud from a book of prairie poems she'd found in a trader's wagon. On the first snow, she stood at the cabin window and watched the flakes feather down. He came up behind her, arms winding around her waist. "You warm enough?" he asked. "I am," she murmured. "Always." He kissed her temple and she leaned back into him, her body soft with trust, her eyes full of quiet joy. They didn't mark time with calendars anymore, only with the turn of the season and the rhythm of their work. Each day had its place. Each silence, its meaning. One clear morning in late March, Willa stepped out onto the porch in her wool shawl, her hand resting on her rounded belly. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting the land in soft gold. Silas followed her out, his hands still smelling faintly of horses and cedar. They stood side by side, watching the light spill over their field, the swing swaying gently from its rope, the coop quiet, the smoke curling up from their chimney. "I was thinking," she said, "if it's a girl we could name her Emma." He nodded, his jaw tightening just slightly. "That'd be right." "And if it's a boy," Silas turned to her, his voice low, "then he'll carry my brother's name." She didn't need to ask which one. They stayed like that for a long time, watching the land they'd claimed not with force but with care. Nothing loud, nothing grand, just the quiet, steady life they'd chosen together. Inside, the fire crackled. The bread rose in the pan. And the future uncertain and wide as the prairie waited just beyond the porch, golden and warm. They didn't speak of what they'd escaped. They only spoke of what they'd built, and they never stopped choosing each other. Every morning, every dusk, forever.